Hey, what's up, guys? Um, in today's lesson, I'm gonna teach you guys about understanding sympathetic versus parasympathetic pharmacology and understanding how to think about these things. So there's two prime examples. One is the bladder, and two are the eyes. So the first thing is you have to think about peeing, right, or urinating. You have to understand. First, you have to ask yourself, is it under sympathetic control or parasympathetic control? And if it's under sympathetic control, it uses adrenergic receptors. If it's under parasympathetic control, it uses the cholinergic system. Two different systems. The sympathetic uses alpha and beta receptors, and the parasympathetic uses cholinergic receptors, usually just M3 receptors for the most part. So you have to ask yourself, if I'm urinating, what system am I using? Cholinergic, or sorry, sympathetic or parasympathetic? Well, in urination, you have your, rest and you just think rest and digest. It makes more sense that you would be relaxed when you're urinating. So it goes under the cholinergic system, right? So the parasympathetic uses cholinergic receptors, and then you have to understand the the mechanical parts of urinating. You have a detrusor muscle, and then you have the internal urethral sphincters. Those are the two components of urination. So if someone wants to urinate, you gotta have contraction of the detrusor muscle and relaxation of the internal urethral sphincter. So because of that, the parasympathetic system is really easy. You just have acetylcholine binding the M3 receptors on the detrusor, which causes contraction, and then you have the what's it called, the radial muscles of the internal urethral sphincter, which basically contract in such a way that you have basically, it's like trampoline strings, and they're pulling, the muscles are contracting such that the hole opens. Okay, so yeah, so that's easy. So for sympathetic, though, what's happening is you don't want to urinate because you're in fight or flight. Evolutionarily, it doesn't make sense to urinate. So basically, then you have to think about the anatomy again. If I want to hold in urine, the detrusor muscle has to relax, and the internal urethral sphincter has to contract, right? So under these conditions, I'm in the sympathetic system, which uses adrenergic receptors. So adrenergic is a little bit trickier, but just for me, the way I think about it is relaxation is usually associated with beta 2 receptors, and muscular contraction is associated with alpha 1. So you want to relax the detrusor, so that's going to mean norepinephrine binds to the beta 2 receptors on the detrusor to achieve relaxation of the detrusor, and your internal urethral sphincter, the what are they called? The what's that word? Basically, you have like two components. It's kind of like you have the dilator muscles, and then you have the um, like the sphincter muscles. Yeah, the sphincter muscles. Those ones are gonna have to contract. So then that would be alpha 1. So when you're holding in urine or in the non-urinating state of body, you're gonna have the detrusor muscle relaxed, so that uses beta 2, and then the internal urethral sphincter will be contracted to hold in urine, so that'll use alpha 1 receptors. So basically, what I'm trying to say is, when you're thinking about the pharmacology of the way things work in the body, you want to think of it like, what is the goal I'm trying to achieve? Okay, I'm trying to urinate, so ask yourself, whenever there's a bodily action, what system does it fall under, sympathetic or parasympathetic? Once you get there, then you can automatically know what receptors are involved. And then you have to ask yourself, what mechanical actions are needed to achieve what I want to do, which we already talked about. If it's voiding, then you want to contract the detrusor and relax internal urethral sphincter. This falls under parasympathetic, so then you know you're using cholinergic receptors. Okay, that's how you want to think about this. And then for pharmacology, then you understand that, for example, medications like bethanechol, it's a muscarinic agonist, so that's why you're gonna stimulate all these cholinergic receptors, which is why bethanechol will help with people who have, for example, like what's it called, overflow incontinence. For example, people who are diabetics or who have multiple sclerosis or some sort of reason why their bladders aren't really working. That's one pharmacological approach. And for example, oxybutynin. Oxybutynin is an anticholinergic, so it blocks the cholinergic receptors. It prevents the cholinergic receptors from being stimulated, which prevents you from urinating. So that is a pharmacological medication used for people with, for example, urge incontinence, right? And then you can start like being able to derive things. There's drugs, for example, you can attack the adrenergic receptors, right? If you want to do like anyways, you get the point. Okay, so then my second example I wanted to talk about that's very high yield for understanding the approach for um, what do we call it? Like sympathetic, parasympathetic pharmacology is the eye, right? The eye has two components. You have your dilator pupillae and your sphincter pupillae, right? So first, you want to ask yourself, when my eyes are dilated, is that under the fight or flight, or is that under the rest or digest? Well, the way I think about it is when your eyes are dilated, evolutionarily, you, in a fight or flight response, you want your eyes to be maximally dilated so you can see as much as possible, so you can absorb as much light. So then when I think about that, I know that that must be under the sympathetic system, which will use adrenergic receptors. And then I ask myself, what is the anatomy involved? Well, I have two components, just like the bladder. I have the dilator pupillae and the sphincter pupillae. So when I'm under fight or flight, I need to, in order to achieve maximal pupillary dilation, I need constriction of my dilator pupillae, and I need relaxation of my sphincter pupillae. Or just, you can just, exactly. So basically, then I know that alpha 1 usually is muscular contraction and beta 2 is usually relaxation, right? So basically, to achieve dilation, then I want to make sure that my dilator pupillae are contracting all around the ring of the pupil, right, around the iris muscles, right? I want those to contract, so then I get dilation, and then I know automatically that that's going to be using alpha 1 receptors, right? So then if I have an alpha 1 agonist, for example, that in theory should be able to dilate my eyes. Or then let's think, under under parasympathetic control, then your eyes will constrict. And there's only two components to the eye, like we said. So if I want my eye pupils to constrict, then we're going to need to stimulate the sphincter pupillae. And parasympathetic is easy because it's usually just one receptor, and it depends on the muscle. It gets a little bit complicated, but then I know that if I target the M3 receptors in my sphincter pupillae, then I will achieve pupillary constriction. So any type of M3 agonist will cause my eyes to constrict. And then that's where you can start, that's the basis for pharmacology. Then I know if I block any of these, it's kind of like a tug of war, then you can have a variety of effects, right? So example, if I use an M3 receptor blocker, M3 likes to constrict the pupils. If I block that, I don't get constriction, so then my pupils will dilate. If I have a alpha 1 blocker, then for example, in theory, then my eyes, alpha 1 usually will dilate the eyes, then I won't be able to dilate, then my eyes will constrict. And remember, high yield for step 1 is that for cases such as glaucoma, where you have surplus of what's it called, aqueous humor, then usually things that constrict the pupils allow for maximal outflow through, like, the, what is it called, the canal of Schlemm, and there's one more thing, the canal of Schlemm, and the, I can't remember, but there usually it'll maximize outflow because when you constrict the pupil, it'll open up that space. So for example, the way you want to think about this is, if I want to improve aqueous humor outflow, I want to have constriction of my pupils. So how could I do that? There's two ways. One would be to stimulate the cholinergic receptors, which will cause constriction of my pupil, which will maximize outflow, or two, block the sympathetic response of the eyes, which is the alpha 1 receptors, block those from dilating, and then by doing that, I'll have constriction. So anyways, this is kind of a short spiel of how to, like, approach your thinking for this, and if you start to think this way, you'll truly understand sympathetic and parasympathetic pharmacology. Instead of just memorizing things, you can start understanding these concepts, and then things will start to make more sense. Anyways, if you have any more questions, just let me know in the comments, and I'll be happy to help you.